The people who laugh the loudest are usually the least prepared for what happens next. I didn't expect anyone to applaud when I walked into the ballroom alone. I just hoped they would pretend not to notice. Instead, every conversation seemed to slow for a heartbeat before the whispers began. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, champagne glasses shimmered in every direction, and an orchestra played a familiar love song that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy dress, took one steady breath, and reminded myself that surviving a divorce had already taught me how to keep walking through uncomfortable rooms. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 39 years old, born and raised outside Chicago, and until 18 months ago I believed marriage was something you repaired instead of replaced. Tonight was supposed to be my oldest friend's wedding reception, a celebration filled with people who had once called me family. Instead, it felt like walking into the final chapter everyone else thought they had already written for me. I noticed Daniel almost immediately. My ex-husband stood near the dance floor wearing the same confident smile that had once convinced me everything would always be okay. Beside him stood his new girlfriend, elegant, perfectly styled, surrounded by guests who seemed eager to welcome the future while quietly erasing the past. I looked away before our eyes could meet. Not because I was afraid, but because I had spent too many nights learning that peace sometimes begins with refusing to replay old conversations inside your own mind. Then I heard it. A laugh. Another followed. Someone whispered just loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. She actually came alone. Another voice answered with a chuckle. Guess fairy tales really do expire. I kept walking. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step slower than the noise around me. Years ago those words might have shattered me. Tonight they landed like distant echoes bouncing off walls I no longer lived inside. Still, I would be lying if I said they didn't sting. There is something uniquely lonely about realizing people who once celebrated your happiness now treat your heartbreak like entertainment. A server approached with a silver tray filled with sparkling water and champagne. I accepted a glass of sparkling water, thanked him with a smile, and moved toward the edge of the room where towering windows overlooked the city skyline. Outside, black sedans drifted through the evening traffic below, their headlights stretching across rain-soaked streets like ribbons of light. Inside, another burst of laughter rose behind me. Someone actually applauded, as if my arriving without a date somehow confirmed every rumor they had repeated over the past year. I didn't turn around. I simply rested one hand against the cool crystal glass, watching reflections dance across the skyline while the orchestra transitioned into another slow melody. They believed they were watching the saddest moment of my story. None of them noticed the line of luxury vehicles quietly pulling beneath the entrance canopy outside. None of them noticed the security team stepping out first. And not a single person in that ballroom realized that within the next 30 seconds, every confident smile in the room was about to disappear. The first black sedan rolled beneath the entrance canopy so quietly that almost nobody inside noticed it. I only caught the reflection because I was standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Another vehicle followed behind it. Then a third. Their glossy black paint reflected the hotel lights as uniformed valets exchanged quick glances that suggested this was no ordinary guest. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Conversations drifted through the ballroom as if nothing unusual was happening. Behind me, someone lowered their voice just enough to make sure I could still hear it. Maybe she is waiting for another blind date. A few people laughed again. I closed my eyes for half a second and let the sound pass through me. 18 months earlier, those same words would have followed me home. They would have stolen my sleep and replayed in my head until sunrise. Divorce changes people in strange ways. It does not only teach you who leaves. It teaches you which opinions no longer deserve a place in your life. I remembered the woman I used to be before everything unraveled. I had built a successful event planning business from a tiny office above a coffee shop outside Chicago. I loved creating beautiful moments for other families, birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, charity galas. Then Daniel received an incredible promotion that required constant travel. We talked about priorities. We talked about timing. We promised each other that there would be plenty of years left for my career. So I sold my company, packed away the business files that had taken nearly a decade to build, and chose our marriage instead. At the time, it felt like love. Looking back, I realized it was trust. Trust is a beautiful thing until only one person is protecting it. I never blamed him for working long hours. I never complained about canceled vacations or late dinners or weekends spent answering business calls. I believed we were building one future together, not two separate lives under the same roof. Somewhere along the way our conversations became shorter. His smile became practiced. The silence at our dinner table slowly replaced the laughter that had once filled every corner of our home. There was no dramatic explosion. No unforgettable argument. Just hundreds of tiny moments that quietly carried us toward different destinations. By the time the divorce papers were signed, I had already mourned the marriage months before it officially ended. That was the part no one in this ballroom understood. They believed I had lost everything. They never saw the mornings when I learned to enjoy coffee by myself again. They never saw the evenings when peace finally sounded louder than constant disappointment. They only remembered the headlines of my life, never the chapters between them. A faint murmur suddenly spread near the ballroom entrance. One conversation stopped. Then another. Even the musicians seemed distracted for a heartbeat. Curious faces turned toward the grand doorway. The laughter behind me faded into uncertain whispers. Whatever had just arrived outside had captured the attention of every person who had spent the last 10 minutes watching me. I slowly lifted my eyes from the city lights and looked toward the entrance, wondering why an entire room had gone so unexpectedly quiet. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the entrance at exactly the same moment. The conversations dissolved into scattered whispers. Even the wedding photographer lowered his camera, distracted by the unexpected arrival unfolding beyond the glass doors. Two security professionals entered first, their movements calm and deliberate, scanning the room without creating a scene. They stepped aside as another figure appeared beneath the golden lights of the hotel lobby. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to introduce himself. I recognized him immediately. Alexander Hayes. My heartbeat skipped once before settling again. We had agreed he might arrive later if his board meeting in New York ended on time. I never expected him to make it. I certainly never expected him to walk into this room. Around me, people began exchanging puzzled looks. Someone whispered his name. Another guest quietly pulled out a phone, searching for confirmation. Daniel frowned toward the entrance before glancing back at me, confusion replacing the certainty he had worn all evening. His girlfriend leaned closer, clearly asking who the newcomer was. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. He did not know. Neither did most of the people standing around him. They knew the headlines about billion-dollar acquisitions. They recognized magazine covers displayed in airport bookstores. They had simply never imagined seeing the man behind them standing only a few yards away. Alexander acknowledged no one. Not the wedding planner rushing toward him. Not the hotel manager offering a welcoming smile. Not the guests who instinctively straightened their jackets as he passed. His attention never drifted from me. Step after measured step, he crossed the ballroom while hundreds of crystal lights reflected softly above us. The orchestra continued playing, but the music suddenly felt distant, as though the entire room had moved underwater. I stood perfectly still, uncertain whether to smile or simply breathe. The last time I had seen Alexander was 3 weeks earlier in Boston after a charity foundation meeting. We had shared coffee before he boarded a flight to London. He had smiled and said, "Leave Saturday evening to me." That was all. No explanation. No promises. Just those 5 words delivered with the same calm certainty that defined everything about him. Now I finally understood. He stopped directly in front of me. The silence around us became almost tangible. Without the slightest hesitation, he offered his hand. His expression carried the same warmth I remembered from our first conversation nearly a year earlier, when neither of us had known the other's full story. "Claire," he said softly, "I hope I did not keep you waiting." I could not help smiling. "Only a few minutes," I answered. A faint laugh escaped him before he gently took my hand. It was a simple gesture. Respectful. Natural. Yet it seemed to drain every remaining whisper from the ballroom. Daniel stared without blinking. Several guests exchanged stunned expressions. Moments earlier they had watched a divorced woman standing alone beside a window. Now they were witnessing one of the most recognizable business leaders in America looking at her as though nobody else in the room existed. And none of them had the slightest idea how our paths had ever crossed. For several long seconds nobody moved. It was remarkable how quickly confidence could disappear from a crowded room. The same guests who had been whispering only moments earlier suddenly found themselves searching for words that refused to come. Alexander still held my hand with quiet confidence, never squeezing too tightly, never making a performance out of the gesture. It was respectful. Natural. That simple detail somehow made the silence even louder. Daniel finally stepped forward with the hesitant smile people wear when they realize they may have misunderstood everything. "Claire," he said carefully, "I did not know you were coming with company." His eyes shifted toward Alexander, clearly hoping for recognition. Alexander offered a polite nod but did not release my hand. "Good evening," he replied with calm professionalism. Nothing more. Nothing less. Daniel waited for another sentence that never came. The conversation simply stopped there, leaving him standing in an awkward pocket of silence. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. One of the wedding guests finally broke the tension by introducing herself to Alexander, mentioning that she had admired several of his business interviews over the years. He thanked her graciously before turning his attention back to me. "Have you eaten yet?" he asked. I smiled. "Not yet." "Then we should fix that before the speeches begin." It was such an ordinary question. No dramatic announcement. No grand display. Yet somehow that ordinary kindness carried more weight than every whispered judgment I had heard since walking into the ballroom. The hotel staff reacted almost immediately. A banquet manager appeared beside us with remarkable timing, personally escorting us toward one of the reserved tables near the front of the reception hall. I noticed the surprised expression on the wedding coordinator's face. Earlier she had politely suggested an empty seat near the back of the room because every other table had supposedly been assigned. Suddenly a place of honor had become available. Funny how quickly logistics improve when perception changes. As we walked across the ballroom, conversations quietly resumed behind us, although the tone had completely shifted. Nobody was laughing anymore. Instead I caught fragments of whispered questions. How do they know each other? When did this happen? Was she dating him? Why did nobody know? The rumors had simply changed direction. That was another lesson divorce had taught me. People who build opinions from appearances rarely stop guessing. They only choose different stories when the facts surprise them. We reached our table, and Alexander gently pulled out my chair before taking the seat beside me. Across the room I noticed Daniel watching us, his confident posture noticeably less certain than before. His girlfriend leaned toward him several times, asking questions he clearly could not answer. For the first time all evening, I realized something important. I no longer needed anyone in that ballroom to understand my journey. Their approval had never been the destination. Peace had been. And somehow, sitting beneath warm chandelier light beside a man who valued quiet respect more than public attention, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Not victory. Not revenge. Simply the comforting feeling that my life had finally begun moving in the right direction long before anyone else had noticed. Dinner was served, but almost nobody seemed interested in the food anymore. The ballroom had regained its familiar rhythm on the surface, yet underneath it I could feel a current of curiosity flowing from table to table. Every few minutes another guest glanced in our direction before pretending to continue a conversation that had clearly lost its focus. Alexander noticed it too. He smiled faintly as he unfolded his napkin. "People are remarkably creative when they do not know the truth," he said. I laughed quietly. They usually become less creative once they finally hear it. He raised his glass of sparkling water with an amused expression. "Then perhaps we should keep them guessing a little longer." It was such a simple exchange, yet it reminded me why spending time with him always felt effortless. He never tried to impress a room. He never measured people by titles or appearances. Long before I knew anything about his wealth, I had only known him as the man who stayed after every charity meeting to help stack chairs instead of rushing toward the cameras. Most people would never believe that. They only knew the version printed in business magazines. They did not know the man who remembered the names of hotel employees or thanked every volunteer individually. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies invited everyone to prepare for the wedding speeches. The bride and groom stood together beneath soft golden lights while families gathered closer to the dance floor. As the applause filled the room, I noticed Daniel looking toward our table again. This time there was no arrogance in his expression. Only unanswered questions. I wondered what story he was telling himself now. Perhaps he believed Alexander and I had known each other for years. Perhaps he assumed I had somehow planned tonight to make him jealous. The truth was far less dramatic. Life had simply continued after our marriage ended. Mine had quietly led me somewhere completely unexpected. Halfway through the father of the bride's speech, Alexander leaned slightly toward me. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" he asked. I smiled immediately because I did remember. It had happened nearly 11 months earlier at a charity fundraising event in Boston. He had arrived without introducing himself, carrying a box of donated school supplies alongside several volunteers. I had mistaken him for another event coordinator. After handing him a clipboard, I had smiled and said, "If you are here to help, then you are on my team now." He laughed softly at the memory. Nobody had spoken to me like that in years. "Because nobody recognized you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Because nobody forgot to." That answer stayed with me. It explained more about Alexander Hayes than every television interview I had ever watched. While the room applauded another heartfelt speech, I realized something else. Every meaningful moment that had brought us together had happened long after I stopped searching for someone to rescue me. I had rebuilt my own life first. Everything else had arrived afterward. And somewhere across the ballroom, I could feel dozens of people trying to understand a story whose beginning they had never bothered to notice. The applause faded as the bride and groom shared their first dance, and for the first time that evening the ballroom seemed to breathe again. Soft piano notes drifted beneath the chandeliers while guests gathered around the dance floor, their earlier curiosity settling into quieter conversations. I watched the newlyweds smile at one another and realized how strange it was that hope could still exist in the same room as heartbreak. Life had always worked that way. One story ended while another quietly began. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his attention on the couple rather than the whispers surrounding us. "You planned weddings for years," he said. "Can you still enjoy them without thinking about schedules and seating charts?" I smiled. Old habits never disappear completely. I still notice every centerpiece that is slightly off-center. He laughed. "I was wondering why you kept looking at the flowers." "Occupational hazard," I admitted. "Some people hear music. I see timelines." His expression softened. "That is one of the things I admire about you. You notice details everyone else overlooks." Before I could answer, the bride approached our table with her husband beside her. Emily had been my closest friend since college, and although the evening had become far more eventful than either of us expected, her smile remained as warm as ever. She hugged me gently before turning toward Alexander. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Claire has spoken very highly of you." Alexander shook her hand. "The invitation was generous. I would not have missed your day." Emily hesitated for a moment before lowering her voice. "I hope tonight has not been uncomfortable." I glanced around the room. Several people quickly looked away after realizing I had noticed them watching. "It started that way," I answered honestly. "But I think it ended differently." Emily nodded with quiet understanding. "Sometimes people only recognize someone's value after they have already judged them." Those words lingered in my mind long after she returned to the dance floor. Across the room, Daniel caught my eye for the first time that evening. There was no resentment in his expression now. Only reflection. He gave a small, respectful nod. I returned it just as politely before looking away. There was nothing left to prove. Some chapters deserve closure without another conversation. Alexander followed my gaze for a brief moment but said nothing. He understood that silence can be kinder than unnecessary words. A waiter arrived carrying dessert, and the ordinary rhythm of the reception slowly returned. Laughter filled the room again, this time softer and more genuine than before. Outside the tall windows, the city lights stretched across the skyline, steady against the darkness. I realized that my future no longer felt uncertain. It felt open. Not because of wealth or recognition or the opinions of strangers, but because I had finally learned that the right people never ask you to become smaller in order to belong beside them. They simply make room for you to become yourself. The evening gradually settled into a comfortable rhythm, yet I could still feel curious eyes following us whenever conversations paused. It no longer bothered me. There was a time when I believed every opinion carried weight, but experience had taught me that most judgments are made long before the truth has a chance to arrive. Alexander excused himself briefly to greet the bride's parents, leaving me alone at the table for the first time since he had entered the ballroom. Within moments, someone approached. It was Daniel. He stopped a respectful distance away, keeping his voice low enough that nearby guests could not overhear. "Claire," he began, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him calmly, surprised less by the words than by the sincerity behind them. He glanced toward the dance floor before continuing. "I spent a long time believing that moving on meant proving I had made the right decision. Tonight I realized those are not the same thing." I did not answer immediately. Some moments deserve silence before words. "We both made choices," I finally said. "What matters is what we learned from them." He nodded slowly. "I never thanked you for everything you sacrificed when we were married." The admission hung between us, honest and uncomplicated. I smiled gently. "You do not have to thank me anymore. Those years helped shape the person I am now." Before either of us could say anything else, Alexander returned. Daniel extended his hand without hesitation. "It is a pleasure to meet you properly." Alexander accepted the handshake with the same quiet courtesy he showed everyone. Likewise. There was no competition in the exchange, no hidden challenge, only mutual respect. Daniel wished us both well and walked back toward his table. As he disappeared into the crowd, I felt something inside me settle completely. The past no longer felt unfinished. Alexander looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You handled that with remarkable grace." I smiled. Holding on to resentment is exhausting. I have had enough of carrying heavy things. He laughed softly. That might be the wisest sentence I have heard all month. The band began another song as couples drifted onto the dance floor. Alexander stood and offered his hand once more. "Would you like to dance?" I accepted without hesitation. The music was slow, the room warmly lit, and the conversations around us faded into the background as we joined the others. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no grand declarations and no audience to impress. It was simply two people sharing an ordinary dance after an extraordinary year. As we moved across the floor, I realized the greatest changes in life rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, one decision at a time, until one evening you look around and discover that the place which once reminded you of loss has become the place where you finally recognize how far you have come. The evening drifted toward its final hour, and the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed so completely that it almost felt like a different event. Earlier, curiosity had been mixed with quiet judgment. Now the conversations carried a different energy, one shaped by respect rather than speculation. I noticed familiar faces approaching our table one after another, each offering warm greetings that had been noticeably absent when I first arrived. Some congratulated Alexander on recent business achievements before introducing themselves to me with genuine interest. Others apologized, indirectly or directly, for having allowed distance to grow after my divorce. I accepted every kind word with appreciation, but I no longer measured my worth by how many people chose to stand beside me. That lesson had taken time to learn, and I had no intention of forgetting it. As the band prepared for the final set of the evening, Emily returned to our table carrying a small bouquet from one of the centerpieces. She placed it gently in my hands and smiled. "You always believed every celebration should leave people with something meaningful to remember," she said. "Tonight I think you reminded all of us what that really means." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Alexander noticed the thoughtful expression on my face. "You are thinking about something," he said quietly. I looked around the ballroom one more time. Daniel was laughing with relatives near the dessert table, but the laughter no longer carried the edge it had earlier in the evening. His new relationship seemed comfortable, and for the first time I sincerely hoped he would find the happiness we had never managed to build together. Wishing someone well after disappointment is not easy. Yet somehow it felt lighter than carrying old resentment. "I was thinking about how strange life is," I answered. "1 year ago I would have dreaded walking into a room like this. Tonight I almost did not come at all." Alexander smiled. "I am very glad you changed your mind." A photographer approached and asked whether we would mind standing together for a picture with several close friends of the bride and groom. We joined the group, smiling naturally as the camera flashed several times. There was nothing staged about the moment. It was simply another memory being preserved alongside dozens of others. As we returned to our seats, my phone vibrated softly inside my handbag. A message had arrived from an unfamiliar number. For a brief moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. I opened the message and read a single sentence. "Thank you for showing more grace tonight than I deserved. I truly wish you a beautiful future. Daniel." I looked toward the other side of the ballroom. He did not wave or try to catch my attention. He simply continued speaking with family members, leaving the message to stand on its own. I slipped the phone back into my bag without replying. Not because I was angry, but because every important conversation between us had finally reached its natural conclusion. Some endings do not require another sentence. They simply require the courage to let silence become peace. The reception slowly came to an end as guests gathered near the entrance, exchanging hugs, laughter, and promises to stay in touch. Outside, the cool evening air carried the familiar sounds of the city, while the hotel lights reflected across the pavement after a brief spring rain. Alexander and I stepped through the front doors together, neither of us in a hurry to leave. Behind us, the ballroom doors opened one last time as the newlyweds waved goodbye to their families. It struck me that endings and beginnings often share the very same doorway. A valet brought Alexander's car around, but before opening the door he turned toward me with the same calm expression that had first earned my trust. "There is something I have wanted to ask you," he said. His voice was steady, almost understated, as though the question mattered too much to be hidden behind dramatic words. From his jacket pocket he removed a small velvet box. He did not kneel. He did not try to gather an audience. The sidewalk belonged only to us. Claire, the happiest part of my life began the day you treated me like an ordinary volunteer instead of an important name. You reminded me that respect cannot be purchased and kindness cannot be negotiated. I would be honored if you would let me spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in people was never misplaced. He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring that reflected the city lights without demanding attention. My eyes filled with tears, not because of the ring itself, but because I finally understood what genuine peace felt like. It was not excitement. It was certainty. I smiled through a quiet breath and answered the only word that truly belonged in that moment. Yes. Alexander slipped the ring onto my finger, then gently held my hand as though he had been doing it for years. Across the entrance plaza I noticed a few remaining wedding guests leaving the hotel. Some smiled when they saw us. Others simply nodded before continuing toward their cars. There were no whispers anymore. No laughter. No judgment. Only ordinary people witnessing another ordinary moment that happened to mean everything to two lives. As we drove away, the skyline stretched across the windshield, bright against the night. I thought about the woman who had hesitated before walking into the reception only a few hours earlier. She had feared being defined by her divorce. Instead, she left carrying a future she had never imagined. Looking back, I realized the most important victory had never been changing anyone else's opinion. It had been refusing to let their opinion become my identity. The people who laughed had only seen one chapter. They never saw the quiet mornings spent rebuilding confidence, the difficult afternoons learning to stand alone again, or the unexpected friendship that slowly became love without either of us forcing it. Real happiness rarely arrives with perfect timing. It arrives when you have finally stopped believing your worth depends on someone who chose to walk away. Sometimes life does not reward you by restoring what you lost. Sometimes it rewards you by leading you somewhere you never would have found if everything had gone according to your original plan. As the city lights disappeared behind us and the road opened ahead, I realized that my story had never been about the end of a marriage. It had always been about finding the courage to begin again.